Hello, welcome back to the Middle Ground. I'm Elizabeth, bringing you 10 years of experience in moderate political analysis. I have already had my first request or my first feedback on my video. I was expecting to make some different videos today, but this is a great topic to discuss. It's very pertinent to a lot of policies in a few different countries. I won't limit it to just two. This is feedback about my Germany related video talking about the new coalition. I was very tired yesterday when I made that video. Excuse me for stumbling over some of my words. I may have made a mistake that the Green Party was in the coalition government for the first time, which is an error. And I know that it was an error because I have been on an energy panel with former Green policy members of parliament, at least one. And what I want to talk to you today about is a lot of the ramifications of previous green energy policy when Green Party was in the coalition with the CDU, which is about around the turn of the century. So from 1998 to 2005, the Green Party was in coalition with the CDU government, which is what gave rise to a lot of the solar energy industry, actually. So there's a lot of topics to cover. I want to start with a history of the energy transition in Germany. The energy transition in Germany started around 2000, and it wasn't necessarily related toward clean energy. The inciting incident was the Chernobyl disaster, when there was a big nuclear reactor meltdown in Chernobyl and left radioactive area of the country that no one could live in. So that part of the country has since been inhabitable and will be for several decades to come. Germans saw that, and the German landmass is nothing compared to the Russian landmass. So to have a significant amount of land use taken away and becoming uninhabitable in the middle of Europe, in the middle of Germany, would be a much higher percentage of the available landmass in Germany. So it was a high priority, and that's where the German energy transition began. There's a lot of criticism because Germany's energy transition has excluded nuclear energy. Other countries like the UK have seen nuclear energy as a transition energy source until other renewable energy sources are can keep up with the production. There are a lot of other issues related to reliance on 100% renewable energy that technology has been trying to address for several years. So the Green CDU coalition really helped the solar industry go from a garage project. It was seriously projects in somebody's garage, very amateur, to professional technology that could be used and scaled up industrially. And obviously the German solar industry has encountered some big problems, made some potential mistakes in taking some of their manufacturing to Asia, and had a lot of their intellectual property stolen and undercut their prices. But the good news is the German solar industry is on the rebound and is making a strong comeback. I was on a panel on the future of energy at a Clean Technica Revolution Tour conference a few years ago in Berlin with Hans-Josef Fell, a former Green Party MP in the Bundestag, who helped implement a lot of that policy the last time the Green Party was in coalition with the CDU. I want to fast forward to today and some of the project's implications in the energy policy in Germany that the current Green Party will have to address when they have come back into government. This also has implications in the United States. So United States political parties are watching Germany. I have a lot of conversations with my father on this topic because of the energy price differences. I would say to US political parties, I know that the Biden administration does want to move forward with a renewable energy transition as part of his infrastructure projects. I would say there's a lot to learn from the mistakes the German government has made and the current problems that need to be resolved. One of the first issues are the rising consumer prices because of tariffs. And this is an example of where the German Green Party has not thought about implications of their policies. And I have seen it in recent campaign discussions in the past election cycle. They just want to propose, every time they propose energy fixes, how to pay for it is always another cent tax. My father pays 11 cents per kilowatt hour in the United States for energy. I pay 3 times that much. And I think consumers and voters have definitely been reacting very negatively to the ignorance of the political parties that keep doing this. 1 cent tax is not a lot, but it is if you do it 15 times. So they keep making excuses. Well, if we just add a 1 cent tariff, it's not a lot. But you don't realize that you were doing that for the last 20 years. And so 1 cent is not a lot. But if you put a cent on top of a cent on top of a cent a couple of dozen times, it becomes a lot to the consumer. And there's a lot of consumer outrage about this issue. Some of the other issues around the nuclear transition have involved a lot of inconsistencies. So while Germany does not produce its own nuclear power, it does have to purchase nuclear power from France and Switzerland in areas that are close to the border. And that results in additional costs because then they have to pay additional tariffs on purchasing that energy. There's just a lot of tariffs built in to the current renewable energy transition policies, and all of this needs to be resolved. The problem with the Green Party's policies is that, as I mentioned in my previous video, they're a little bit head in the clouds. They're not always grounded in reality. They don't think about unintended consequences. I've just mentioned one example. So they always want to continue pressing forward with the renewable energy transition. But in my study in this area in the last 4 to 5 years, talking to people in the energy industry about these problems, what I've resolved is I'm going to use an antiquated example. Younger generations might not be familiar with the example I'm going to use, but those of us who remember a time before cordless phones and before cell phones, we all remember the old phone cords that were a coil. Well, in my house, in our office, we had a house phone that had a very long, extended, coiled phone cord. It was actually a rotary phone, doesn't matter. Won't get into that technology. And it was great because we could take it into the dining room, we could take it into the kitchen, and while we were on the phone with somebody. And if you had projects that you were working on and you wanted to catch up with an aunt or a cousin, and you wanted to go sit down and continue working on that project, or you wanted to continue cooking in the kitchen, it offered a lot of flexibility, except when it got tangled up. So it had the capability of stretching very far. But if there were knots in this coiled cord, it wouldn't stretch. So right now, in German energy policy, there are knots in the cord. You can't continue stretching it out. You can't continue moving it forward until you untangle the knots. So hopefully, even though some of us might not follow the example I gave, we can all understand the principle. It's a very visual analogy for the complications that need to be resolved before they keep pushing forward with the renewable energy transition goals. And they should do it quickly because there are very ambitious goals toward carbon neutrality that countries in Europe and Germany have committed to reaching. So addressing these issues are important. You can't move forward until you go back and you fix the hangups, the problems that are really preventing the situation from having more solutions. This is related specifically to the US uh, energy policy because there's also a dependence on oil. And in both countries, this starts to develop a national security problem. I mentioned that my father comes from a conservative background, but he is very pro policies for the United States moving away from dependency on oil. Obviously, in the US, the oil industry has always, for the last 100 century at least, had too much money and too much political power and has created a lot of problems that we are now all trying to clean up. So, one of these is an ignorance about the national security problems that arise from our dependence on oil. The issues are slightly different in Germany. As I've mentioned, a lot of the issues in Germany revolve around the hiccups in renewable energy transition. Some people blame the problem in Germany based on the fact that Germany did not rely on nuclear energy for the energy transition. So I've discussed the pros and cons of that decision that was reached, but people who are critical of that decision look at the Germany's continued reliance on oil as an example of a bad outcome of not relying on nuclear energy. This is very current right now because of the dependence on Russia for that oil. And with political and military tensions heating up very rapidly in Europe with Russia, it really begins to create a national security problem for Germany as well. So those are some issues in energy policy that both the US and Germany are facing. Rising costs of energy created by tariffs that are implemented to cover costs of the transition. Hopefully the US can find other means to finance it and learn the lesson from Germany and not bring increased energy costs to the consumer and the national dependence and the national security threats from becoming dependent on oil. In the US, I didn't really go into those specific threats, but because the US cannot meet its own oil demand, but because the oil industry has created this dependency on oil in the United States, then we have to go to other regions where there's military conflicts and it becomes very dangerous for the US to supply that oil, creates enemies in regions of the world just because the US's dependency on oil and addiction to oil dominates US foreign diplomacy and policy issues. I've created an outlook on foreign policy. I did not bring up the oil energy industry debate in that topic. However, I always talk about US foreign policy as being anchored down by this oil question because they cannot relate with other countries in a healthy, independent way with this codependency problem surrounding oil. So even the members of the Conservative Party and the Republican Party in the United States are opposed to national dependency on oil. Those are the main talking points and points I wanted to cover about the energy policy. As I said, the Green Party in Germany hopefully can do a better job. Definitely needs to address these problems. The Biden administration can learn a lot from the problems that Germany currently faces in this area with energy policy. I think that there are a lot of new solutions that need to be found There's still a lot of valid questions surrounding some of the renewable energy industries providing enough energy. My father's constantly having this question for me as well. It's an ongoing discussion. I hope you'll take part of it with me here in the middle ground. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm Elizabeth. Have a wonderful day.